A reading from the Psalms. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps. From there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. Here ends a reading from God's word. Thanks be to God, who is still speaking.
Well, in my last job, before I became a full-time intentional interim, I was the associate and educator at a Methodist church. And as we were preparing for staff meeting, the senior minister informed me, says, now you have a job, you need to pick the patron saint of the church for the next year. I wanted to walk outside the building and go, this is a Methodist church. Patron saint. Well, we grew up, many of us, in the Protestant tradition. We threw the baby out with the bathwater. We decided that we didn't need these saints. We tried to ignore them. But in my early life, I sort of fell in love with a saint. And I fell in love with a guy named Francis. Why did I like St. Francis? Well, it sort of starts with a certain movie. Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. Anybody remember that? I see a few hands. It was done by Franco Zeffirelli, who also did the Romeo and Juliet that came out, I think, a couple of years before that. But he filmed there in Assisi, and that sort of sparked my interest in who this saint is. And I thought, well, why? Why did I fall in love with him? Well, a few years ago, one of my fellow ushers, when I was living in Charlotte, said, I'm going on a trip. I want to go to Italy. Would you like to go? And I was going like, well, yes, Marco Cipolleti. I mean, a guy who was born there, speaks the language. I mean, that's a pretty safe person to go traveling with. So we were planning the trip and everything. His father's first generation American. His mother was Italian. They met when he was in the armed services, and he was born in a little town called Vicenza in the northern part of Italy. Beautiful little town. So he got to pick that town, and I got to pick my town that I wanted to go to. Anybody want to guess where I'm going? Right. That's the little town. In fact, right down here is the train station, and when you pull up, there is the little town of Assisi sitting up on the hill. And so we got off the train, found a place where we could leave our luggage for the day, and paid the person, and then we proceeded to take a bus up to a certain point, and then you start walking. And then you come up to the Church of St. Francis. And the picture doesn't do it justice, but there's a series of low steps going up. I don't know how many they are, but you are climbing to get up to the church. Now, the church is developed into three areas. There's an aerial view of it. But then you go down in the sub-basement, and that's where St. Francis's body is buried. And you walk around that area, and then you go upstairs. We were there on a Sunday. In fact, it was the Sunday after Easter, but it still was very crowded. They didn't understand about Low Sunday, and that we celebrate here in the United States and not go to church. And then there's a middle level Very low ceilings, covered in paintings. I'm not sure if they're frescoes technically, but every inch of the space is covered. But it's a very low ceiling. It's very claustrophobic to be in that space. And that's called the middle church. And then you go upstairs to the beautiful Gothic space. And so we were there, and of course, Marco is Roman Catholic. He says, I want to go to Mass. I said, okay. The service is in Italian. So I literally sat at the pew, and I felt like I was back in old times. And I sat there, and because all the walls are covered with frescoes of the life of St. Francis. So I stood while the sermon was going on, everything. I was staring and looking at the pictures. I turned on the other side and looked because I was absorbing the life of St. Francis while I was there. And when the service was over, I was sort of upset because I wanted to sing. All creatures of our God and King. And boy, inside my soul wanted to sing that as we were walking out. And as we were walking out, right over here, right at the doorway, is the famous fresco of St. Francis preaching to the birds. The story of Francis talking to the animals. Well, that's one of the reasons I like St. Francis, is that he has a love of nature. When I was in the 7th grade in my weekly reader, y'all remember the weekly readers? Yes. We learned a new word on the cover, smog. Remember that word? Combination of smoke and fog, and talking about the pollution in LA. Ooh, you know. Of course, I didn't realize that someday I would be living near a river that burned about that same time. You know, but, you know, I was growing up, ecology became the thing. But you realize that this 13th century person, mystic, was realizing that we are all connected to the creation, that the earth is important, and that we cannot separate ourselves or put ourselves above. As he always talks about everything being a brother or a sister, somehow we're connected. Just like Heather in her prayer talking about the sun, the moon, the wind, the fire, all these elements there are part of who we are. And so that call to love the earth was part of the reason that I loved him. Now, on my bucket list, and I also know that I have another fellow clergy person, this is on their bucket list, is that someday I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be at the Church of St. John the Divine in New York City for the Feast of St. Francis when they have the procession of animals. And if they can, they start off with an elephant. And they have all kinds of animals. You can see that Great Dane there. It's the longest cathedral in the United States of America. And they process as they sing All Creatures of Our God and King. And the last thing that comes in is a person holding a bowl of plankton. From the largest animal they can find in the city of New York to one cell. Saying, this is all about God. This is what God has created. Well, the other part that I love about St. Francis is his call for the renewal of the church. I have had this passion from my early days about renewal in the church. It constantly, even in the 13th century, St. Francis knew the church needed to be renewed. In fact, in this movie, he literally rebuilds a church building. But in that process, he calls the church into renewal. I don't think the church ever should stop not being in renewal. My favorite and best class I ever had in seminary was Church in Renewal by Finley Bartow Edge. He called the church. He had spent his whole life teaching at the seminary. And then when his church in Albany, Georgia, and that's the proper pronunciation of that town, when the deacon stood out on the front steps of the church and was going to refuse to let any black person walk into their building, he said, something is wrong. The church is not right, and I've been doing it wrong as a professor. And so he started the whole issue about renewal in the church. Today, you can go and see the little building that he rebuilt. Of course, they've added and built a bigger building all the way around it. There it's down just right across the street from the railroad station where he built that church. But the church is always called to be in renewal. We should never be satisfied by our spiritual life and how we should live our life. Of course, I think St. Francis best said it when he said what we attribute to his prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace, and where there is hatred, let me sow love, and where there is injury, pardon. The night that I stayed up watching my dad before he died, I was preparing and writing out his service. A task that I didn't think I was ever going to have to do, but that night I did. So I was trying to figure out how to honor him, and this came to mind, because he embodied that, just like St. Francis, my patron saint. And so the best way I know for us to remember is have this beautiful voice sing it for us.
Make me a child.